this is the big one. GB News can confirm that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor has relocated to a property on the Sandringham estate belonging to His Majesty the King.
Andrew didn't leave in disgrace. He disappeared.
We have some breaking news this morning. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor has been kicked out of the Royal Lodge by his brother, the King.
After years inside a 30-room estate, paying next to nothing, he slipped out late on a February night in 2026. No cameras, no daylight, no goodbye. What looked like a quiet move became a turning point the moment he reached his new home. Because this time, tradition paused, rules shifted, and silence spoke louder than protest. Everything that followed exposed how far the fall truly went. How did an arrival become a test of acceptance? Buckle up, because what's coming will leave you speechless. The night he left Royal Lodge. February 2nd, 2026, was not marked by announcements or official statements. There were no palace photographers, no carefully managed optics. Instead, long after sunset, Andrew quietly departed Royal Lodge, the sprawling Windsor Great Park residence that had been his home for more than 20 years. The timing was deliberate. Sources would later suggest that leaving in daylight was never an option. The humiliation, they said, would have been unbearable. For years, Royal Lodge symbolized stability, at least on the surface. 30 rooms spread across nearly 100 acres, a lease secured decades earlier under terms that later became a public controversy. Andrew had clung to the property even as his public standing collapsed. According to reports, the plan had been to remain there a little longer, pushing the move closer to Easter. But plans change quickly when pressure builds behind closed doors. That pressure surged with the release of a new batch of Epstein-related material.
I've never really felt the need to go and party, and certainly going to Jeffrey's was not about partying. Absolutely not.
Though Andrew has consistently denied all allegations, the renewed scrutiny made one thing clear: his position at Royal Lodge had become untenable. What was once a slow, carefully managed exit suddenly turned into an urgent departure. The decision was made quietly, and the execution followed the same pattern. Vehicles were moved discreetly, lights stayed low. There were no goodbyes exchanged with neighbors or staff. The symbolism was hard to miss. A man who once represented the monarchy abroad, who attended state dinners and public ceremonies, was now leaving his longtime home in silence, choosing darkness over exposure. His destination was Wood Farm Cottage on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, a modest property by royal standards and one associated with privacy rather than prominence. It was the same place where his late father had spent much of his retirement, away from public life. On paper, it sounded like a quiet retreat, temporary, practical, and dignified. But even before Andrew arrived, the tone had shifted. This was no longer a graceful relocation. It was a retreat shaped by circumstance, scrutiny, and an unmistakable loss of standing. The move itself became a statement, not because of where he was going, but because of how he was leaving. As the gates of Royal Lodge closed behind him, the chapter that followed was already taking shape. Wood Farm was meant to offer calm and distance from the storm. Instead, it would expose just how dramatically his position had changed and how far removed he now was from the protections and privileges he once took for granted. So, what quiet decision at Sandringham would make Andrew feel the shift immediately? Stay with us to see what happened next. The rule that changed everything. When Andrew arrived at Sandringham, there was no confrontation waiting for him, no raised voices or dramatic scenes. Instead, there was something far more cutting, a quiet rule change that altered everything. Staff at the estate had been given clear instruction that they were not obligated to serve him if they felt uncomfortable doing so. The choice was theirs, and several, according to reports, had already decided they would rather step away. This was not an act of defiance. No one was staging a protest or challenging authority. What made the moment so striking was its calm, procedural nature. Permission had been granted from above. The palace had acknowledged what everyone already understood but had never said out loud. service to Andrew was no longer a given. For someone raised inside a system where deference was automatic, this shift carried enormous weight. Royal households operate on tradition and hierarchy. Staff are trained to serve the institution first and the individual second. For decades, Andrew existed at the center of that structure, surrounded by people whose roles were defined by duty, not choice. At Sandringham, that structure quietly dissolved. The message was unmistakable. Comfort mattered now. Personal boundaries mattered. And Andrew's presence, once unquestioned, had become optional. A source described the situation bluntly, saying there was already quite a list of staff who declined to work for him, not out of hostility, but unease. Symbolically, the moment said more than any official statement ever could. Titles can be removed on paper, residences can be reassigned. But when household staff are empowered to walk away, it signals a deeper collapse of standing. Respect, once institutionalized, had become conditional. What made this even more jarring was the contrast with the past. Andrew had once moved through royal spaces with ease, supported by layers of protocol and protection. At Sandringham, none of that applied. He was not surrounded by a dedicated household. He was not insulated from discomfort. Instead, he was faced with a reality shaped by personal choice rather than royal obligation. The instruction itself was carefully worded. Staff were not ordered to refuse service. They were told they didn't have to serve him if they felt uncomfortable. That distinction mattered. It shifted responsibility away from the institution and onto individual conscience. In doing so, it exposed how far Andrew had fallen in the court of public and private opinion. This wasn't about punishment. It was about acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that the situation surrounding Andrew had become so fraught that expecting automatic service was no longer reasonable. The monarchy, long criticized for protecting its own, appeared to be drawing a line, not loudly, but unmistakably. For Andrew, the impact was profound. The humiliation wasn't delivered through confrontation or condemnation. It arrived quietly, through absence, through doors not opened, through interactions that no longer happened. In many ways, that silence was louder than outrage. By the time this rule took effect, his relocation no longer resembled a temporary adjustment. It felt like exile without the formality. A man once surrounded by constant attention now navigates spaces where his presence causes hesitation. But how did a prince born at the center of power end up navigating silence instead of ceremony? Stay with us. The rise before the collapse. Born at Buckingham Palace on February 19, 1960, Andrew entered the world at the very center of British royal life. From the beginning, his position carried weight. He was the third child of the reigning monarch, raised within traditions that few ever experience firsthand. Ceremonies, uniforms, and expectations were woven into everyday life, shaping a sense of belonging that felt permanent and unquestioned. As he grew older, Andrew carved out a public identity that, for a time, worked in his favor. His service as a helicopter pilot during the Falklands War earned praise and admiration, casting him as a modern royal willing to take personal risks. That period elevated his standing both inside the palace and with the public. He was seen not just as a royal by birth, but as someone who had stepped forward when it mattered. In 1986, his marriage to Sarah Ferguson brought renewed attention and energy to the monarchy. The wedding was celebrated widely, watched by millions, and framed as a fresh chapter for the royal family. Together, they became parents to two daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, further cementing Andrew's role as a central figure in royal life. For years, his family image, though imperfect, remained intact. At one point, Andrew was second in line to the throne. That fact alone defined how he was treated, where he lived, and how he moved through the world. State dinners, overseas tours, and ceremonial duties were not exceptions. They were routine. He represented the crown abroad, met world leaders, and occupied residences that symbolized stability and privilege. Access, protection, and deference came naturally. Even after his marriage ended, Andrew's position appeared secure. He retained his titles, his properties, and his place within the institution. Criticism surfaced from time to time, but it never seemed capable of causing real damage. The system around him absorbed pressure, allowing him to continue largely unchanged. Looking back now, that sense of permanence feels striking. The contrast between then and now is difficult to ignore. The man who once moved effortlessly through formal rooms filled with staff and ceremony now finds himself navigating quiet spaces marked by hesitation and distance. The applause, the invitations, the unquestioned authority, all of it has faded. What makes the fall so stark is how complete the rise once was. Andrew didn't hover on the margins of royal life. He stood firmly within it. His access wasn't symbolic. It was practical, visible, and deeply embedded. That level of inclusion makes his current isolation feel less like a gradual decline and more like a rupture. In hindsight, the warning signs are easier to identify. Confidence hardened into entitlement. Protection became expectation. And somewhere along the way, associations formed that would not loosen their grip, no matter how much time passed. So which past decision was about to resurface and crack that permanence wide open? Keep watching to find out. The interview that changed everything. For years, Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein existed in an uneasy space, acknowledged, questioned, but never fully confronted. It lingered in the background, resurfacing periodically through reports and speculation, yet it failed to trigger decisive consequences. That fragile balance collapsed in November 2019, when Andrew agreed to sit down for a televised interview that would permanently alter his trajectory. The BBC Newsnight interview was intended to draw a line under the controversy. Instead, it did the opposite.
8 or 10 of us, I think, at the dinner. If there was a party, then I'd know nothing about that.
As Andrew attempted to explain his continued contact with Epstein and deny allegations connected to that relationship, viewers focused less on the denials and more on what was missing. There was no clear expression of empathy for Epstein's victims, no acknowledgement of the broader harm associated with the case. The absence was striking, and it became the defining feature of the broadcast. Reaction was swift and unforgiving. Media outlets, commentators, and the public expressed disbelief at both the content and tone of the interview. What may have been intended as damage control quickly became a case study in how not to respond to crisis. Rather than clarifying his position, Andrew appeared disconnected from the gravity of the situation, reinforcing concerns instead of easing them. Within days, the consequences became unavoidable. Buckingham Palace announced that Andrew would step back from public duties for the foreseeable future. The language was careful, almost clinical, but the meaning was clear. He would no longer represent the crown. Appearances, patronages, and official roles were suspended. For the first time, his public position had been formally curtailed. The decision was framed as temporary, a pause rather than an ending. But the impact was immediate. The interview had shifted Andrew's standing from controversial to untenable. What had once been a managed issue now felt uncontrollable. The monarchy, long practiced in navigating scandal, appeared caught off guard by the scale of the backlash. Attempts to quiet the situation only seemed to amplify it. Each clarification invited further scrutiny. Each silence raised new questions. The interview became a reference point, replayed, dissected, and cited whenever Andrew's name surfaced. It was no longer just about association, it was about judgment, accountability, and credibility. Internally, the fallout marked a turning point. Stepping back from duties removed Andrew from the public-facing role that had defined his life. Externally, it reshaped how he was perceived. The protective distance once afforded by rank began to erode. Expectations changed. Patience thinned. What was most damaging was the sense that an opportunity had been missed. An opportunity to acknowledge harm, to express understanding, to signal awareness of the wider implications. Instead, the interview froze Andrew in a moment that would follow him for years. So what consequence was quietly taking shape behind the scenes as that frozen moment refused to fade? Stay with us. Settlements, memoirs, and renewed scrutiny. By early 2022, the controversy surrounding Andrew had moved beyond public debate and into the realm of legal resolution. In February of that year, he reached an out-of-court settlement with Virginia Giuffre, effectively ending a civil case that had shadowed him for years. The agreement was carefully worded, containing no admission of wrongdoing, and the exact financial terms were never officially disclosed. Some reports, including estimates from the Daily Telegraph, suggested the figure could have been as high as £12 million. At the time, the palace sought to present the settlement as closure. Official statements emphasized finality and a desire to move forward, framing it as a resolution rather than an acknowledgement of culpability. Yet for the public, the questions remained: accountability, transparency, and the cost of shielding a royal name. The settlement, rather than quieting controversy, became another point of reference in a narrative already marked by scrutiny and doubt. The story took a tragic turn in April 2025. Virginia Giuffre, aged 41, died by suicide on April 25th, a development that reverberated far beyond the legal outcome. Attention shifted from courtroom calculations to the profound human toll of prolonged trauma and public pressure. Sympathy for her deepened, while unease about the broader circumstances surrounding Andrew's actions intensified. The legal closure could not undo the personal devastation, and the narrative surrounding both Giuffre and Andrew became heavier, more irreversible, leaving an indelible mark on the public conscience. Months later, renewed attention arrived in print. In October 2025, Giuffre's posthumous memoir, Nobody's Girl, was released. The book did not introduce entirely new claims, but it reframed the existing ones through personal reflection and lived experience. That shift proved powerful. What had once been discussed in legal language was now presented in narrative form, accessible and emotionally direct. The memoir reignited media coverage almost overnight. Excerpts circulated widely, interviews with family members followed, and public conversation intensified. For Andrew, the timing could not have been worse. Any hope that the issue might quietly fade was erased. The scrutiny he had carried for years returned with renewed force, shaped now by empathy for the author rather than skepticism. Inside the palace, the pressure was palpable. This was no longer a matter of waiting for headlines to pass. Each development seemed to narrow the options available. The institution faced a growing sense that association itself had become a liability. Silence, once a protective strategy, began to look like avoidance. What made this phase particularly damaging was its persistence. There was no single incident to respond to, no statement capable of resetting the narrative. Instead, there was accumulation, years of controversy resurfacing at once, layered with grief and public anger. The sense of fatigue, both inside and outside royal walls, became difficult to ignore. As the memoir dominated discussion, it became clear that patience had limits. Decisions that once felt postponable now seemed inevitable. The question was no longer whether Andrew's position would change, but how decisively the monarchy would act. So how far was the monarchy prepared to go to protect itself once patience finally ran out? Stay with us to see what happened next. When titles were removed and status were rewritten, October 30th, 2025 marked a moment the monarchy had not seen in more than a century. On that day, King Charles took the extraordinary step of stripping Andrew of his remaining titles. The decision was delivered without ceremony and framed through a brief, pointed palace statement. There was no ambiguity in its message. Andrew was no longer a prince. He was no longer the Duke of York. The identities that had defined him since birth were formally removed. In official terms, the move was presented as necessary. The palace cited the need to protect the institution, acknowledging that the ongoing controversy surrounding Andrew had reached a point where continued association was untenable. His persistent denials were noted, but they no longer carried weight within the decision-making process. What mattered was impact, not intent. The significance of the action cannot be overstated. The last time a British prince lost his title under comparable circumstances was more than 100 years earlier. That historical distance underscored just how severe the situation had become. Titles are not merely symbolic within the monarchy, they determine access, authority, and standing. Removing them is a declaration that a line has been crossed. Alongside the loss of titles came the forfeiture of Andrew's lease at Royal Lodge. The arrangement itself had long attracted criticism. Secured in 2003, it allowed him to occupy a 30-room estate across nearly 100 acres for a minimal upfront payment and what was described as a peppercorn rent. For years, the deal had been defended as lawful, but questioned as inappropriate. With the titles gone, the justification collapsed. From that point forward, Andrew's status was rewritten. On paper, he became a private individual, no official role, no public duties, no institutional shield. But the reality went further than paperwork. Within royal circles, he became someone to avoid rather than accommodate. Invitations disappeared. Access narrowed. The protections once quietly extended to him were withdrawn. The decision also sent a message beyond Andrew himself. It signaled a shift in how the monarchy intended to respond to sustained controversy. For an institution often criticized for moving too slowly, this was a decisive act. It acknowledged that reputational damage had limits, and that preserving tradition sometimes required breaking with it. Public reaction reflected the gravity of the moment. Some saw the move as overdue, others as unprecedented and unsettling. Either way, it confirmed what many had already suspected. There would be no rehabilitation, no gradual return. The door had been closed. Yet even that closure proved temporary. The loss of titles did not quiet the story. Instead, it sharpened attention, setting the stage for what came next. With institutional ties severed, scrutiny intensified rather than faded. And just as that seemed final, another wave arrived. Keep watching to find out. When the files landed, January 30th, 2026 brought a reckoning that few inside the palace could ignore. On that day, U.S. authorities released an enormous volume of material connected to the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. Millions of pages of documents, along with thousands of images and videos. The scale alone ensured global attention, but buried within the release were details that immediately reignited scrutiny around Andrew. As journalists and investigators began combing through the files, familiar names and locations resurfaced. Emails dating back more than a decade were scrutinized line by line. Among them were exchanges attributed to Epstein and an individual identified as the Duke, referencing meetings and introductions that raised fresh questions. Even more damaging were allegations tied to specific places, claims that some encounters occurred at Royal Lodge itself. For the monarchy, the symbolism was explosive. Within days, British authorities confirmed they were assessing the information. The statement was measured, but the implication was clear. This was not being dismissed. The idea that allegations might now be linked to an actual royal residence marked a sharp escalation. Royal Lodge, once defended as a private home, was pulled back into the spotlight as a site of alleged wrongdoing. Across the Atlantic, political pressure began to build. American officials publicly suggested that Andrew should be prepared to answer questions. While no legal mechanism existed to compel his testimony, the message was unmistakable. The issue had moved beyond tabloid speculation and into the realm of international accountability. The distance once created by geography no longer offered protection. What made this moment particularly damaging was its timing. Andrew had only recently been stripped of his titles and removed from royal life. Any expectation that the story might begin to fade after that decision vanished instantly. Instead, the files reframed everything. They suggested that the monarchy's actions, decisive as they were, had come just as another wave of scrutiny was breaking. The public response reflected a growing impatience. For many, the release reinforced a belief that too much had remained hidden for too long. The sheer volume of material fueled suspicion, even where conclusions were not yet drawn. Each headline added pressure, not only on Andrew, but on the institution that had once shielded him. Inside royal circles, the contrast became stark. While Andrew's name was again dominating coverage, other members of the family were navigating the moment differently. When questioned, working royals responded with caution, emphasizing sympathy for victims and restraint in language. The difference in tone was noted immediately. Silence, when it came from Andrew, felt heavy. Statements from others felt deliberate. One brief exchange involving Prince Edward captured that contrast sharply. Asked about the latest developments, he offered a simple response. Thoughts were with the victims.
I think it's all really important always to remember the victims and who are the victims in all this.
It was a small moment, but it carried weight. It highlighted the divide between those still representing the monarchy and the one figure it had effectively cast out. For Andrew, the files represented something worse than accusation. They represented permanence. Digital records do not fade, and neither does public memory. Each new detail made rehabilitation seem increasingly impossible. The idea that time alone could soften the narrative no longer held. By the end of January, it was clear that the files had done more than reopen wounds. They had reshaped the conversation entirely. The focus shifted from what the monarchy had done to distance itself to what it might still be forced to confront. And as Andrew crossed into Wood Farm, was this finally the end of the story? Or the moment a new chapter began? Stay with us. The new reality at Wood Farm. Wood Farm Cottage was never meant to be a destination. By all accounts, it was a temporary solution, a quiet stopover while renovations at Marsh Farm were completed. Modest by royal standards, tucked away on the Sandringham estate, it carried none of the grandeur Andrew had grown accustomed to. Yet despite its intended role as a short-term arrangement, Wood Farm came to represent something far more permanent, a complete shift in how he was seen, treated, and tolerated. From the moment he arrived, the rules were different. This was no longer a household arranged around his comfort or rank. Staff were no longer assigned automatically. Deference, once built into the system, had vanished. For the first time in his life, service depended on willingness rather than duty. Some staff chose to help, others quietly declined. The absence of obligation was unmistakable and deeply symbolic. What made this moment so striking was its normality. There was no formal announcement explaining the change, no press briefing outlining new arrangements. The shift simply existed. Andrew had entered a space where his presence no longer commanded compliance, where his name no longer opened doors, where comfort was negotiated rather than guaranteed. As this new reality settled in, public attention returned to the privileges he once held, especially the Royal Lodge arrangement that had become emblematic of excess. The lease, secured in 2003, allowed him to occupy a vast estate for decades while paying what was described as a peppercorn rent. In practice, it meant he lived in a property worth tens of millions while contributing virtually nothing annually. For years, the deal had drawn criticism, not because it was illegal, but because it felt indefensible. That criticism had already triggered an official inquiry by the Public Accounts Committee, which examined whether the arrangement served the public interest. The findings lingered in public memory, resurfacing now with renewed force. Against the backdrop of Andrew's relocation, the contrast was glaring. The man who once benefited from extraordinary accommodation now found himself in a place where even basic courtesies were optional. At Wood Farm, the isolation was quiet but complete. There were no formal events to attend, no ceremonial roles to perform, no protective layer of staff managing daily life. The rhythms of royal existence, once so familiar, were gone. In their place was something closer to ordinary life, stripped of insulation and hierarchy. One source described Andrew's current standing with a single word: pariah. It was not said with drama or cruelty, but with resignation. A recognition that whatever status he once held had dissolved beyond recovery. Within royal circles, there was no longer debate about rehabilitation or return. The question had shifted to containment and distance. What made this chapter particularly final was its ordinariness. There was no confrontation, no public reckoning, no definitive closing statement. Just a man living quietly, aware that the protections he once relied on were no longer there. The silence around him was not respectful. It was cautious. Wood Farm may have been intended as a pause, but it became a marker, a clear dividing line between past and present, between privilege and permission, once honored, now optional. And in that quiet transition, the full weight of his fall became impossible to ignore. So what do you think Prince Andrew's move really signals? An ending to his royal influence, or just another twist in a saga still unfolding? We'd like to hear in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.